I think investors need to realize that it's not going back to an old normal. If there's one message that I would give to investors, it is not going back to an old normal in any of these areas, in terms of supply chains, in terms of resource access, in terms of social disintegration within various countries. And I think there was a feeling a year ago and certainly 2 years ago that, well, we'll just get through this and things will go back to normal. They're not going to go back to normal in terms of people's attitude about work, just across the board. And that's going to have fundamental, both, it will create huge problems. It will also create opportunities.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be with you all. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments, and I'm joined today by Dee Smith, who is the CEO and founder of Strategic Insight Group. Dee, it's nice to be with you again on Real Vision. I hope next time we get to do it in person, but for now, we're still operating through the web. How's it going?
It's great. Thank you. Great to be here, and at least we have the web to operate through. So.
Well, let's just get right to it. I don't want to beat around the bush at all. Before we kind of turn to the past and the future and get into some of these other things, I thought I would start you off with a hard question, which is, I looked at the front pages in all the newspapers this morning, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Bloomberg, everything. And the main thing seemed to be this NATO statement that Russia did not fire the missile that landed in Poland. Shopkeepers are protesting in Iran, and everybody is fixated on the Biden-Xi Jinping meeting that happened earlier this week in Bali. What I wanted to throw to you was, let's imagine for a second that it's November 16th, 2023. What do you think will be on the headlines then? And do you think any of the stories that people are tracking today so closely in the headlines are going to pull through to the next year?
You can certainly look at certain trends, and you can look at certain indicators. And I'll preface this by saying, as you know, in the national security world, things will go from way down on the list to at the top of the list because of events that occur. But I think that one element that is going to probably be on the top of mind is some more intense expression of strange weather, climate anomalies, that sort of thing. I suspect the summer of 2023 is going to be worse than the summer of 2022, which was already pretty pronounced in what happened from a weather standpoint. So I think that because I think those kinds of crises are at another level above the crises of the moment that we're dealing with today, which are certainly very serious. But that ties to so many things, including displaced persons, migration, internal migration within countries. If there's some major event that dramatically affects one or more big cities, when that happens, it will happen with climate change and melting of ice, and the Thwaites Glacier, for example, in Antarctica, that the ice, floating ice that blocks it is melting fast. So something is going to happen at some point. And when that does, assuming we avoid something like a nuclear war in the current situation in the Ukraine and with NATO and Russia, that kind of thing is going to make all the rest of the crises we're facing, at least for the moment, look like a church picnic, because it's going to drive such enormous, wrenching, sudden change in the system. Now, beyond that, I think it's probable. I'm at least hoping that the Ukraine situation has ground down to a stalemate or a victory for Ukraine. I think, however, if we push Putin completely out of the country, and I think that is what needs to happen. But this is a true dilemma: is that if we give him some kind of a off ramp, he gets some little sliver of Ukraine. Well, Ukrainians don't want to do that anyway. But if he does, that's not going to satisfy him, because he objects to the existence of Ukraine as a country and as a culture, really. And so, he'll just regroup and go back at it. On the other hand, if we completely push him out, we may back him into a corner where he does use nuclear weapons. So it is a classic dilemma. So I don't know where that will be. I suspect it may be at a stasis, or it will have moved in some place that it's not today. I think that there is, potentially within that time, a conflict over Taiwan, although I would put it a little bit farther out in time. I think she's got his hands full right now, and it's hard to see that he can quickly resolve those things enough to take that action, which would be very difficult to do for anyone. And so, those are the things that I guess would be the major ones. I haven't covered a lot of them, financial issues and so forth, but you asked, I answered.
Yeah, well, I was going to say we're off to an optimistic start here. So a major climate disaster, stalemate in Ukraine, maybe nuclear weapons, and maybe some Taiwan.
Hi, I'm Raoul Pal, the CEO and co-founder of Real Vision. The financial world is a complicated world right now. It's a really complicated macro picture, and there's a lot of risks. Real Vision and our YouTube channel help you navigate those risks. So subscribe now to the channel and never miss an update. There is simply too much going on. So subscribe now. Thank you.
Well, why don't we roll it back a little bit? And I can answer this question too if it helps. But so I was wondering, around this time last year, maybe tell us, a prediction or a thing that you got right and a thing you got wrong. For example, I was pretty sure that Russia was not going to invade Ukraine and that Iran was going to rejoin the nuclear deal. Got both of those wrong. I was happier with my predictions on China, where I talked about economic problems, and I didn't think she was going to go after Taiwan next year because of the Party Congress. So when we think back to the last year, because you made the point about prediction for the future is very difficult. Former Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs once said, prediction about the past is even more difficult. Tell us about last year, maybe, and what you got right and what you got wrong, because that might be a way to sort of help us push some light forward on what's going to happen next year.
I'll give you two things that I did get right and one thing that I got wrong. I did think that, I'm going to give you one domestic thing and one international thing. I did not think that there would be a red wave. And the reason I didn't is that I was reading subtle indicators, and subtle indicators are a leading indicator type thing. What the group think is a trailing indicator. It's showing what people have been thinking. It's not showing how change is working. And so I, in looking at the Supreme Court decision and the various elements that brought about in terms of resistance to those ideas, and it's some other elements that were out there. It just did not seem to me that there was going to be the red wave that everyone predicted. I thought that was pretty much conventional thinking, and that it probably wasn't going to happen. What did surprise me, though, and I'm very pleased that it did, I got it wrong. I thought there would be a lot of contention after this election in the U.S. And in fact, the extent to which people have, gracefully accepted defeat, or at least accepted it, whether gracefully or not, has surprised me. And it surprised me in a good way. And I think that it's very, very interesting that not only did we not have a red wave, but that really there was almost none of the kind of thing we saw in January of 2021. So, I found that very heartening, actually. The other thing that I did get right is the thing that you graciously pointed out you got wrong, which is I did think the Russians would invade, and I thought that for several reasons. One, if you were reading what the kinds of things Putin was putting out, and the sources, the people he was associating with, like Dugin, they were very, very hard-lined about this, and it goes back to some very large theories about what Russia is and Russia's moral superiority as a land power as opposed to a sea power, which the Russian philosophers that surround Putin think, or they think they're weak and they're mixed. They mix cultures, and you shouldn't mix cultures. And so there was all this chatter around, and then he's moving large numbers of troops across the largest landmass country in the world. And it just seemed to me that it wasn't a bluff. I think it was one of the Russian authors, maybe Turgenev, who said, if you show a gun in Act 1, you have to use it in Act 2. And so I think that's a Russian thing. So that one I got right. I'm sorry I did. I would much rather it hadn't happened.
Well, let's stick on that then, because I think this is one of the critical things that probably the Real Vision audience needs to think about going forward. I have begun to think about 2023 and 2024 from a standpoint of how do you take advantage of Russian weakness? Because it seems to me that Russia is incredibly weak. You said, we have to worry about putting Putin in a corner. What is he going to do? It seems to me nobody cares what Putin says anymore. Russia's been threatening to withdraw from the grain deal in the Black Sea, for example, in recent weeks. The Ukrainians keep exporting, and the Turks are lecturing the Russians that they have to stay in the deal, and they don't really care what Putin has to say. So you also mentioned some of those ideologues in Russia who wrote some of the justification for going into Ukraine. They've started targeting Putin in public, going after him and saying that he, as the leader, bears culpability from this retreat from the Kherson region and how badly some of the war has gone. So what do you think about what's going to happen in the Russia-Ukraine war going forward in the next year? And how do you think investors should think about how to position themselves around that uncertainty?
Well, I think that, Putin is being criticized, but a lot of the people who are doing that in terms of his withdrawal are criticizing from the right of him. In other words, there are people who think that Russia should not. They agreed with the invasion. They disagree with the repositioning and the withdrawal and so forth. So it's the harder line. The danger is, and I think it is, as you're pointing out, it's problematic to focus just on one person, even though it's also true that we have to focus on one person when they're in a position of power like that. But I think that if Putin goes, who replaces him is the question. And it could be somebody worse. There are people farther to the right. And the other thing is that someone like Putin has his claws into people in many different ways. Now, the more we have sanctions and the more we have, other ways to contain Russia, not letting them fully participate in the international banking system and so forth, the weaker Putin's weapons against his own cronies are. But he can still do things to people which are likely to, personally and to their families, which are likely to keep certain people under control. And so, it's an imponderable, really, but at some point he'll go. And the question is when and what will replace him? Because if it's anytime soon, it could be somebody much worse. And that's a concern. I think that's a real concern. And, I think investors need to realize that it's not going back to an old normal. If there's one message that I would give to investors, it is not going back to an old normal in any of these areas, in terms of supply chains, in terms of resource access, in terms of social disintegration within various countries. And I think there was a feeling a year ago and certainly 2 years ago that, we'll just get through this and things will go back to normal. They're not going to go back to normal in terms of people's attitude about work, just across the board. And that's going to have fundamental, both, it will create huge problems. It will also create opportunities, but it's going to make investors have to be much, much more agile and much better informed, unless they want to take a passive route. And I think there's something to be said for that nowadays. But I don't think that you can't just stay the course, because the waters that you're in are far different from what they were in 2019.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. What do you think about Russian export of various commodities going forward in the year ahead in the context of the war and this domestic political turmoil in Russia? Russia's a major exporter of oil. It obviously used to be a major exporter of natural gas to Europe. That seems to be off the table now. It's also a major exporter of wheat globally, other mineral commodities. But things that we've been seeing with Russia is the Europeans either don't want their natural gas anymore, or pipelines are suspiciously blowing up. Russia had close to, I think it was either close to a record or a record wheat crop this year. Nobody wanted to buy Russian wheat because you didn't want to be seen buying things from this Russian regime that went into Ukraine in general. So there was a lot of also sensationalism, I felt like, when the war began, that Russian oil production was just going to completely collapse as soon as Western companies left. That hasn't come true, but maybe Western countries are not willing to buy Russian oil for some of those reputational concerns. So how do you think about Russia in the context of it is such an important part really an outsized importance in terms of its in terms of how critical it is to the global economy because of the concentration of different exports in certain commodity classes that Russia has. Do you think that they continue to export, whether it's Putin or some other right-wing monster? Do you think we're looking at Russian exports of key commodities falling off a cliff, and so we should look a little closer at things like wheat and platinum and oil that maybe won't get to market because of what's going on in Russia? Help us understand how the resource issue is going to intersect with some of the things that you've talked about.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue, as you're well aware, and I think that the first thing to say about it is that we have a obligation, I think, to take action, and we've been taking action. We may have to take more action against someone who invades somebody else's country, because if that's allowed to happen, it's not only Russia that will do it, it's other countries that will do it. And we're back in a balance of power world like the late 19th, early 20th centuries. We're getting there anyway, but we don't need to rush that process. We don't need to enable it. And so I do think that the sanctions have had effect. I think that, you and I may disagree on this. I fundamentally come down on the side of the anarchist theory of foreign relations. Is that that there is no. I mean, we have these multilateral organizations that we forged over the last 70 years or so, but there's no real. There's nothing to constrain nations other than other nations and their fear of reprisals and consequences. So if you just let Russia do this, then and I think that is that idea. It's the idea of the liberal international order, but it goes back some way to the treaties of Westphalia, which were an attempt to end 131 years of war in Europe, and the idea of national sovereignty. And that the nations could do, and the idea that the violating of national sovereignty was not something that should be allowed. And so Russia did a huge violation of that, and they tried to couch it in terms that had to do with history and their read of culture, and we're based on some historical correct elements. That the Kievan Rus was the start of Russian civilization 1,000 years ago, but that's not it's not relevant in terms of the power structures today. So that's all just a prelude to say that I think Russia is going to continue to act in ways that are going to continue to push the West to find other solutions and to keep the structures in place to restrict trade in Russian resources. However, I also think that and this is why I brought up the idea of the anarchic system of international relations. In the reality, there'll be plenty of people who break that rule, and some who never accept it. And you've got examples of that now, China, India, and so forth. And you have examples of countries like India, which on the one hand is very much positioned itself with the U.S. and with the West, but on the other hand, it, in terms of Russia, has not. And so everybody's playing a game that tries to balance appearances, strategic direction, and the practicality of resources. And so, there are always going to be cheating, if you want to call it that. There's always going to be people who violate those strictures. But I think my personal feeling is that the West will leave them in place. And again, I think this is one of those areas where it's moved so far from the previous normal that it would be very difficult to move it back. And I don't think anybody trusts Putin anyway. And so if you rearrange things and then he breaks it again, I hope we've learned that lesson. In terms of resources, it is critically important. And one of the things that you only referred to obliquely is potash. It's another good example. And that's now been put under sanctions for the two biggest producers, Russia and Belarus, which produce something like 40% of the world's potash. And potash is irreplaceable in fertilizer. So it is creating huge disjunctures. But I think that the geopolitical environment is such that it's going to be very hard to put back in place the kind of open trade that existed let's say until 2019 or so. Probably you could say it's 2017 because the U.S. government, for other reasons, were starting to restrict it with China. But the whole globalization realm was something that began to seriously end sometime between 2015 and 2019, and then 2020, the pandemic completely changed things in several ways that accelerated a lot of these trends. There's one other point I would make about Russia, and in particularly in terms of recent events, and it's a troubling one, and that is that those people we've been talking about to the right of Putin, and they've influenced Putin quite a bit, have developed some theories that are really disturbing, and sometimes some people in the policy world are calling it Götterdämmerung, Twilight of the Gods. It's obviously an opera by Wagner, but refers back to ancient Norse mythology, Germanic mythology. Anyway, the idea is that, as I've seen it said, if the world doesn't have a place for Russia, then Russia doesn't have a place for the world. And there's some concern that there are people with an apocalyptic mindset who would just bring the whole thing down. It's an incredible thing to contemplate that there are people who would do that, but I've seen enough signals about it that I don't think you can dismiss that, and that's a very troubling thing.
Well, Dee, we have to stay on that point a little bit then. I was going to move to China, but we'll wait a second before we pivot to China. It's funny you mentioned the anarchic theory of international relations. I actually agree with you probably more than you think. I've been rereading my Thomas Hobbes in the context of understanding what is going on in the FTX debacle. I won't go down that rabbit hole right now. But obviously, I think the state of nature is brutish and nasty and short. And when human beings are not constrained by governments, they do terrible things to each other. I don't think human nature is as rosy as most people think. I will say, though, that I don't think the only constraint on nations is other nations. The other constraint that we haven't talked about here is the Russian people, a people who are incredibly sophisticated, who for centuries have given us some of the greatest art, and culture and even scientific advances the world has seen over. And yes, I am sure that there are right-wing ideologues in Russia who would like to take over for Putin. As an Israeli cab driver once said to me, in every family or in every house, there's a trash can. I mean, you have those sorts of things in every single country in the world. I cannot imagine, though, that the majority of the Russian people would tolerate that. The flip side of that, though, is that the Russian people have not risen up against Putin, despite mass conscriptions, despite everything that Russia is doing in Ukraine right now, despite the Russian economy and the Russian ruble coming under great stress. So maybe I'm being a little too optimistic there, but I would think that if you got to the point where somebody who's listening to Wagner and Twilight of the Gods came in power, or even if Putin himself ordered a nuclear strike, that a general would say, "Thank you for your service, Vladimir. Why don't you go out to pasture and we will take it from here?" Am I being a little too optimistic? Is there not some potential for the Russian people to rise up here and end this? Or is it really, like you said, Twilight of the Gods time?
Well, I don't think it's Twilight of the Gods, and I hope not. But I think that the problem with the Russian people rising up is the same problem with the Chinese people rising up or the Cuban people rising up, and that is that authoritarian governments that set their mind to surveilling and controlling populations can be very successful at it for a surprisingly long time. Now, yes, things do get to a flipping point, and they can arrive at that very suddenly, and that's how the world works. Things don't change gradually, they change suddenly, and that's one of the things that I find brought up human nature, one of my favorite subjects. And one of the things that I find so curious about us as a species is that we're always so surprised by sudden change. But when you think about it, the big changes in your life don't happen you don't have a heart attack over a period of a month or a car wreck over a period of a year. These things happen very quickly. And that tends to be the way nature works. And yet we're always so surprised. That's an aside. But I just, it's at a tipping point, I think. And it's going to break depending on how effective his control is, how much he has in place to threaten people and their families. I mean, it literally gets down to that micro level, I think, that granular level. Whether there are people in his circle, and there probably were in the past more than there are now, who would actually move against him and disagree. He's purged a lot of those people. Of course, we all know about all the Russian oligarchs who've fallen off hotel windows and things that, weren't happening a year ago, but somehow they've all lost their balance. Something's happened. And those are all, of course, assassinations to purify the influence circles around Putin. So I don't think your question is answerable. I think you've answered it. It could go either way, but I don't think we can count on, under that kinds of circumstances we have now, and with the kinds of surveillance technologies and so forth that we have now, I don't think you can count on that as a slam dunk. On the other hand, everybody thought that the Russian military was so formidable and that, it was going to, it was not going to even be a contest. And Putin himself, of course, was lied to because all the money that was supposed to go to modernize Russia, the Russian troops and so forth, actually went into the pockets of generals and people in Swiss bank accounts. And so, that money was never spent the way it was supposed to be. But there was also supposed to be, and this was written about a lot, a very big rethink of how the Russian military operates. In other words, the old doctrine was, if you had an opportunity to take a hill, you had to check all the way up the chain of command and then all the way back down, and then they would give you a yes or no, and by that time the opportunity had passed. And supposedly that wasn't the case anymore. Doctrinally it had changed, but that's not correct. It hadn't changed. And so, I think it was a paper tiger. And now a paper tiger armed with nuclear weapon teeth is still something formidable. But on the conventional side, it's I think surprised, and it surprised me. I don't know anybody it didn't surprise. I'm sure it surprised Putin how miserable their performance was, and how they're just no match for even next generation, one generation old Western weapons, which we've been sending to Ukraine. So
yeah, I think one unfortunate lesson of the war, and this is something I expect to see in the year ahead and going forward, is more nuclear proliferation. Because exactly to your point, without nuclear weapons, Russia is nothing. Poland and all these other countries around it wouldn't be scared of Russia at all if Russia didn't have nuclear weapons. So if you're a North Korea or you're an Iran or you're some other up and coming power, you maybe look at the Russia-Ukraine war and conclude, man, it would be really good if I had nuclear weapons, because if I have nuclear weapons, countries are going to treat me a little bit differently and with a little more respect than if I don't have nuclear weapons. Things might go a little bit differently. I want to back into the conversation about China before we conclude the Russia part of the conversation by just saying, you alluded to Russia's access to global markets and things like that. China has been somewhat of a lifeline for the Russians. They're importing lots of, and this is good for China, by the way. They get to import cheap wheat and cheap oil and cheap commodities. That's a good thing, especially with the stresses that the Chinese economy is under. But I was wondering if you thought that the recent Xi Jinping, Joe Biden meeting in Bali and some of this, I mean, it's subtle, but a little bit softer language coming out of Beijing. Is that a signal that maybe China doesn't want to be sort of lopped in with Russia here, that they see that Putin really has isolated himself and gone beyond the pale, and they would like to reintegrate into the global economy? Or do you think that that China-Russian relationship is going to continue to be strong in the year ahead?
Before I answer that, let me back up to your very interesting comment to sort of end our Russian discussion. And I think you're 100% right that this does send the message that if you have nuclear weapons, you have a force field around you. Sort of, the people are not going to, really bother you as much as they would if you didn't. And I am 100% sure that the Ukrainians think that, because they did have a very large nuclear arsenal, and there was an agreement. It was obviously not papered well enough, and maybe the Russians wouldn't have agreed with it, wouldn't have followed it anyway. But it didn't have any way to really enforce it. But there was an agreement that if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, that Russia and the U.S. and the UK, I believe it was, would guarantee their existence as a nation. And of course, obviously, that's meaningless because they don't have the nuclear weapons. So yes, I think it's a very troubling thing, and I think there will be more countries that attempt to get nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons are hard to build and they're hard to maintain, but I do think that you're 100% right on that. To the question of China, I was also struck by I won't call it conciliatory, but the dialed down tone of the Chinese, and particularly as reported by Chinese media. And I think Xi Jinping is scared. I think he's gotten this triumph at the last Party Congress, another term, which is not supposed to have happened. But I think that he's weak, and I think that when you see violent protests in Chinese cities against the no COVID policy, that's not supposed to happen according to Xi Jinping in his world. And so I think that there are many, many things that are working against China right now. And I think he needs to buy some breathing room. This is hypothesizing, but I suspect that he was closer to invading Taiwan a few weeks ago than he is today, because I think he sees there are too many problems. I mean, China has huge food problems, huge protein problems. It's got energy problems. It's got social problems. It's got every problem, environmental problems, just beyond conception. And so I think that he is feeling that he is not as secure, even though this is this thing of ostensible things, surface things. He's had this triumph. He's secured a third term. But what's happening under the water? And often it's the opposite of what it seems to be on the top. So I think that he is, for the moment, more inclined to pull back and less wolf warrior diplomacy and more play nice. I think it's an illusion, but it's something that you never know. Things could develop in such a way that there can be if not a rapprochement, then at least an accommodation between China and the U.S., which would be a good thing, because a war with Taiwan would be devastating to many things, including, even if it didn't go nuclear, including to the world economy, because you've got a situation in Taiwan where they produce, over 90% of the world's advanced microchips. So you would have, a supply cut by 90% for some considerable time, because although they're building factories outside of Taiwan, it's going to take time to get those up and running.
Have you alluded to wolf warrior diplomacy? Have you seen the wolf warrior movies?
I have, yeah.
I am somewhat obsessed with sort of bad, trashy Chinese action movies. Real Vision guys, if you're looking for something to watch in your spare time over the holidays, it's fun, and you'll get a perspective as to kind of how China sees the world.
And the fact that they've taken that term from that movie and made it a central platform of a pillar of their foreign policy is really interesting. Another movie, if we're going to talk about movies for a second about China, that I think encapsulates a lot of the Chinese mentality, the Chinese attitude, which thing is a movie called Hero. Mm-hmm. And it's about sacrifice of the self and of the individual for the system. And that is, that's something that the Chinese certainly have taken from communism, which is, of course, a Western system, but it goes way back in Chinese thought. And it's kind of antithetical to the Western approach that's much more, at least in its modern iteration, much more focused on the individual. So, there's some interesting things. And I agree with you. Movies and other kinds of art can tell you so much, and they can tell it so much more viscerally than dry academic writings about a people's nature and how they're likely to behave.
A sort of a tangent before we leave this, I asked a Russian analyst a couple months ago after the invasion what movies people watch in Russia, just because I was curious, and I knew that we were in trouble, because instead of some action movie I'd never heard of or Western action movies, he said, "Oh well, we watch documentaries of the Great Patriotic War and Russian sacrifices during the 1940s," and I was like, "Ooh, this is not going to end well for you guys if that's what people are quote unquote watching." You mentioned
another key element of Russian philosophy that I think it comes into play here is the idea of purpose, is that things need to be, if things don't fulfill their purpose, then it's morally wrong. And if they do fulfill their purpose, then the sacrifice is worth it. And, for example, I actually had a conversation in Russia with someone about this. And he said, well, how you in the U.S., you cut down so many pine trees for Christmas, and they're all sitting there, and then somebody goes and buys one and puts it up and puts the ornaments on it. Well, that tree's death was good because it fulfilled its purpose. But the ones that never got sold and just ended that's a tragedy because they didn't fulfill their purpose. So it's a different way of looking at things.
Yeah, you mentioned sort of. I want to temper the just how much China-U.S. relations have improved, because before this meeting where Xi and Biden said less hostile things to each other than normal, those U.S. semiconductor restrictions on China were no joke. They are rippling throughout the entire semiconductor industry. They are far more severe than anything the Trump administration did against China and anything the Obama administration did against China, I would argue that. And I think one of the things you're seeing is this acceleration towards different countries looking to relocate semiconductor capacity to their own shores. Now, to your point, it's going to take time. But for me, one of the biggest things that happened this week that got sort of shoved beneath the rug was the Japanese government came out with 8 Japanese companies and said, all right, we're going to throw billions of dollars at becoming self-sufficient in some semiconductors by 2027. And when Japan says we're going to be self-sufficient in something by 2027, that's going to mean things, and I think it's going to mean things throughout the semiconductor supply chain. You'll see that in other industries. But Dee, I actually agreed with you more than I disagreed with you on Russia. I think China is where we are going to disagree a little bit here, because I need you to square a circle for me. I don't see how China can be weak and Xi Jinping can be weak and scared, and yet also thinking about invading Taiwan. Because I don't think China's invading Taiwan next year. I don't think they're invading Taiwan in 5 years, maybe 2030, if they continue on the military modernization path that they're currently on, and the geopolitical system is in their favor. Maybe they'll start considering it then. But it seems to me that they are far too weak for that. That it is much more likely that they would, for instance, maybe try and take an island from the Philippines and test U.S. security guarantees there, or something like that. It doesn't seem to me that Xi, if he's weak, can afford a Taiwan type scenario, because I think he would experience exactly what Russia's experiencing right now, which is defeat. I don't think he can do it. So help me square Chinese weakness versus this fear over an invasion of Taiwan in the next year or two.
I think those are really good questions, and I'm not sure I disagree with you very much. But I will say that 2 or 3 things. First of all, they could easily try to take a Japanese island if they really want to be provocative. And Japan's already saying they're violating their sovereignty and so forth, as you know. But I think that the way to square that circle, but it's not necessarily predictive, but is that China, if Xi Jinping, again, like Putin, feels pushed into a corner, he may feel the need to take some action that he thinks will increase patriotism and increase national fervor. And that is a classic way that people respond if they're really threatened. They attack somebody. And so it's partly because of that I say this. And as you're also aware, there's a debate now that I think has been a long time coming and needs to be really heard out in the foreign policy world, that has to do with whether we ascribe too much importance to the idea that people are rational actors and that they think rationally and that they make decisions rationally and always pursue their own best interest. And there is a growing chorus of people who are saying that, no, that's not how people work. And that this is based on findings in psychology that show that we make decisions for emotional or other reasons. And then we add the rationalization of them as a gloss on top to make them look better, make ourselves feel better about them, and so forth. I don't think that Putin's decision to go after Ukraine was a rational one, unless to him, it may have been. But it was driven by very emotional needs, a certain version of Russian history, and other needs. And I think that Xi Jinping may find himself in a place where the West has gotten the better of him, and he feels that he needs to do something to coalesce a national fervor around it to make people more patriotic in the moment, and second, he sees his legacy. And I've talked to many Chinese scholars, some from China, but he sees his legacy as reuniting the Taiwan and the mainland, and the less time he thinks he has, the more likely that is to push forward. Now, he may just not be able to do it. And there are, as you pointed out with Russia, there are huge social constraints in China. One of the main ones is that after all these years of a one-child policy, people don't want to see their one child killed in action in the Strait of Taiwan, and so that itself, and I think this is why I think it is so interesting that you're seeing violent protests about. I think it's a leading indicator, and it'll be tamped down. But these things they simmer, as we've seen in Iran, and then they boil over, and so I think that it's significant that we're seeing pictures of violent protests against the anti-COVID policy, because it shows. The no COVID policy, because it shows that things are not what he would want us to see them to be. And so I think that there, in a way, I agree with you. From a logical standpoint, I think that he's not ready, and it would be enormously costly, and it might not work. Taiwan itself is building now. There's a Taiwanese billionaire who's partly funding the building of militias and things. It's just, the whole situation is changing dramatically. But on the other hand, he may feel he has no choice. He has to do something. And so it's that emotional decision-making that I'm invoking when I say that the timetable may have moved up on it rather than back. From any rational standpoint, you are 100% right.
Well, I take your point on rationality. That's a construct, and one man's rationale is another man's insanity. So, I'm sure Putin has a rational justification for what he's doing, but it's beyond your and my perception of what rational actually means. I will say the one, I don't know if it's silver lining or saving grace, or I'm in danger of traipsing on psychoanalysis here. She is the son of a family that was very seriously affected by Chairman Mao and some of his purges and crackdowns on the Chinese system. So he is not sort of this Putin ambitious figure. He is somebody who had a front row seat to what chaos and totalitarianism really looks like. And there is some part of me that thinks that maybe what he's trying to do is affect change in China without going that route. But to your point, he might not be able to. Dee, I'll ask you a very simple question. Well, it's a simple sounding question, but I'm sure the answer is complex. And this is especially for Real Vision watchers. Is China uninvestable?
I wouldn't invest in it. It depends on your risk tolerance, I suppose. But I think the problem is that, we're facing a situation where you have forces from the top and forces from the bottom, sort of deductive and inductive, working to, particularly if you're an American, but also a Western European, working against investing in China. And the forces from the top have to do with security. They have to do with, not having Chinese equipment in key devices. And I don't just mean military. I mean our whole 16 critical infrastructure elements, and having a much more control over what we use and where we source it and so forth. But the bottom up one is also interesting because, and it has to do with the pandemic, but I enjoy Italian wine, and it's been very hard to find lately. And being an intelligence person, I researched it because I was interested. And in fact, the problem is that there's plenty of wine. Even during the pandemic, there was plenty of wine produced. It's aging beautifully. The bottles were not available. And so the primary source of the bottles was China. And so you're only going to get a business over that barrel once. And they're going to say, look, I need my things sourced where I can truck them in and they're not going halfway around the planet. And I need to depend on it, because if I can't sell my product, I'm out of business. And I think if you take that bottomed up, inductive force of people wanting to just ensure that they can go on living, and go on in business, then you multiply that times hundreds of thousands of companies, and you have an equally powerful force. So I think China, and then there are all the geopolitical issues too. I would say, again, it depends on your risk, and I know investors who love risk, but I think for the most part, I would certainly not invest in it now, and I would be very, very alert to what is happening to investments that I did have in China.
Mm. That point about, I need supplies that I can truck them in. I think that's a very important point to stay on for a second, because if that point is true, and if we really are moving away from China as the factory of the world, that means the price of different goods are going to go up. I think that's one of the insidious things behind inflation right now. And ironically, what central banks have done to get inflation under control, and I'm not throwing shade here at the central banks, they have a directive, they have to use the tools at their disposal to bring inflation down with the tools at their disposal. But I think one of the unintended consequences of raising rates and hawkishness as fast as it's come up is that maybe companies are not willing to do the capex in finding a new bottle manufacturer who they can truck stuff in. Maybe the high cost of energy also of trucking things in rather than the cheap cost of shipping it around the world also sort of drives up prices. So it seems to me, if you're right about that, if the world is really going to turn away from China, and if a large portion of the U.S. or European companies find that China is uninvestable or unreliable, or they can't depend on those supply chains, it feels to me like we're going to have kind of really, I don't know if it's super high inflation, but that's something that could really keep inflation going longer than most people think, until there is that capex to create those new supply chains.
I again 100% agree with you. We're having a heated agreement here, but I you're the only other person I've been saying that, and I'm really glad to hear you say it, because I think people are not understanding. And the way I would say what you just said is that inflation may now be structural, and it may be structural because of resource constraints, and that means the depletion of resources, the availability of resources, whether they're depleted or not, and that gets into a whole bunch of other things, and the necessity for robustness and resilience rather than efficiency. And there is a demonstrable inverse relationship between efficiency and robustness. And I think that the goal before the pandemic was to make systems as efficient as possible. And we saw that then when you have a real problem, and particularly an unexpected problem, you're really in a bad situation. So I think that the world is going to move towards resilience and, things like, just-in-time inventory, they don't work. And obviously they don't work. And so I think people are going to move towards robustness and resilience. And I think that is going to be more expensive. And I do think inflation is now, I think that regime of low inflation and all that is over. And I don't think we're going back to it anytime in the even somewhat distant future. So I agree with you. And I think there are many reasons. And I think that people are having a hard time with it, as they are with so many of these changes, because it's going to affect the way they live. And they can see that that's the case. And but yes, I completely agree with you. I think inflation is structural.
Dee, we've got about 10 minutes left, and while I could talk to you for hours on all these topics to cover everything in the world, I'm sure the Real Vision producers don't want a video here that is as long as a Wagnerian opera. So let's do one more sort of question to close it out. And that is, again, I want to bring the focus back to 2023. We've talked about some of the biggest risks and uncertainties and dynamics that are driving things in 2023. But what do you think is something that is going to happen in 23, or a dynamic or something that we haven't talked about yet that you think is going to be critical, that is not being talked about enough because of focus on, Trump announcing his election or whatever else is hogging the headlines right now? Where are you focused that you don't think most people are focused in the year ahead?
Yeah, the things of the day. One of the things that I'm most focused on is food, because it is obviously none of us can do without it. And when you start to see shortages of odd things, I understand there's a cranberry shortage and a turkey shortage now here in the U.S. When you start and baby formula, all these things, those are signals that the system is giving you that it's not working right. And in this case, I think, just as we talked about inflation being structural, I think that shortages are becoming structural, because I think there are a whole host of things that are interacting in very complex ways, but that are pushing the system towards a different state than the state that it's been in, which is one of huge amounts of supply and demand always being able to be met and so forth. And I think that we're moved out of that world. And I think that is going to have an enormous effect. And I think that we may see a food crisis. The way I would look at it is that there's a host of things out there that could happen in 2023, 24, 25, and one of them is a real food crisis, and we already just barely averted one this year, but it could happen again. It could be much worse. One of them is a true heat dome somewhere in the world. A heat dome is essentially a stationary high pressure system where the hot air can't escape during a summer system. It has to do with the jet stream, and it does have to do with climate change. And a heat dome would be, something where over a large area, temperatures became literally almost unlivable in the hundreds of degrees, 110, 115 degrees for long periods of time. And I think you think about the economic effects of that. And that's going to happen somewhere. And and of course, the economic effects are dwarfed by the human cost. So, I think that that you're going to see these things, and they're going to reach crisis tipping points. I think that's because things seem like they're the same until suddenly everybody realizes they aren't, and then everybody panics. And you've certainly seen this in the investment world. You saw it in the pandemic, where people just stopped. And they had piles of money sitting there that they needed to do something with. I'm talking about major investors, market maker kind of investors. And they just stopped. And then they finally got to the point where they had to do something. And so then they started re-upping investments they already had, which was not necessarily a good thing to do. And then it kind of got back to normal in terms of the deal flow and looking at things and so forth. They found ways to work around having to be on site so much and, to look at investments. And so then fast forward to last summer, this past summer, and you have this interest rate environment, this credit environment that changes pretty quickly. And, in sort of July, when everybody stopped, not everybody, but they pumped the brakes, and they said, okay, well, we've got to wait and see what happens. Well, let's wait until Labor Day. And then Labor Day comes and goes, and it actually gets worse. So we're now in a period where there are things happening, but there are lots of people saying, well, no, we need to wait until the first of the year. But I'm seeing a cycle here, which is that something unexpected happens, they freeze like a deer in the headlight, and then suddenly they realize, well, we have to unfreeze, we have to do something. And then something else unexpected happens and they freeze again. And we need to get out of that modality, because the world is going to be so full of unexpected things over the next few years that it's going to, if you're not prepared for it, it is going to jar your sense of reality if it isn't already jarred.
Yeah, one of the things I tell both investors and companies that I work with is that, and the COVID-19 pandemic is a good example. Everybody got punched in the mouth by a COVID-19 pandemic. That's why black swans are actually opportunities, because they affect everybody, and literally nobody saw it coming. If somebody saw it coming, it's no longer a black swan. The real test of whether you're prepared is not you or me predicting exactly what's going to happen via our magic 8 balls next year. It's about when the punch lands, who's first off the mat and who has the plan or the gumption to go after it and try and change things. It's that reaction time. Who comes up swinging? Those are the types of companies and investors that I think do the best. And part of that is, the ability to change your mind, to see how things are changing. I'm with you on food being an issue. I will say, I have some optimism that maybe this is the last of La Nina. Maybe we get La Nina to go away. Maybe South American yields can go up a little bit. Maybe we can keep the Black Sea open for grain. Maybe the Ukrainians can plant a good spring crop. There are some things that give me some hope there. But also, to your point, here in the United States or in other developed markets, what is a nuisance or an inconvenience for us, like, we can't get cranberry sauce on the table this year for Thanksgiving, or I have to pay double for the price of a turkey. In a country like Pakistan or in Ethiopia or some of these other parts of the world, they literally can't afford food when there are those shortages, and that creates its own political instability in and of itself. So I actually thought Pakistan was a place that was remarkably resilient this year, considering everything that got thrown at them. I don't know how much pressure you can put in that system before it starts to upend itself, but I agree with you. Those food prices are nice leading indicators in those parts of the world that nobody talks about, but which can maybe foreshadow things to come.
They can. And, we were actually, as you are aware, we were entering a period of food instability before the pandemic. I mean, the signs were all there, and those have not gone away. They've been exacerbated to some extent. And so, I think that it's easy for people to say, oh, that was a pandemic, and now we're getting past it. And, this is this mentality of, okay, well, if we can just fix this, then everything will be smooth sailing. And I just don't see that. I think it's a set of systemic problems that are hugely complex. And we're not going to go back to a previous normal. That doesn't mean we can't go on living unless Mr. Putin pushes the button. And hopefully even then we can. But it means that we're at one of these nexus points where things change, and they happen every once in a while. Certainly the period surrounding and after World War I, leading into World War II, if you take that as a block of time, it was enormous change in the world and in the way people lived and so forth. But they got through it. But you do have to have a much more open. The people who will work well, and the companies who will prosper are the ones with what you just said: an open mind, a willingness to turn on a dime, a psychological orientation towards agility. And the people who are disturbed by change are going to have a harder time. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect place to close, because I've been talking about the pre-World War I era and La Belle Epoque as a model for what's going on right now for a while. And World War I kind of colors our sense of history, because World War I was terrible and it entailed so much destruction and so many bad things happened. But the 1890s and the early 1900s were awesome. They were times of immense technological change, incredible cultural and artistic effervescence. You wake up one day, there's no cars and there's horse and buggies on the street. You wake up the next day, suddenly New York is full of cars. I mean, it was that level of kind of tremendous technological change and wealth generation. So for all of the doom and gloom and scary things that are out here, if we really are entering that sort of period, I would tell you, if you know where to look, and if you can sort of keep a sober mind or a sense of humor about everything that's going on, there are a lot of opportunities here around the margins, because this kind of disruption and this kinds of change does lead itself, to your point, for incredible change. And I think the real question is, as a species, is can we avoid the monster at the end of the story? Can we avoid the big cataclysmic conflict that happens after this period of change? But as I keep telling people, we're in the years of plenty right now. May not feel that way. That may scare you. It may make you feel a little bit more pessimistic about the future. But a lot of the change that's happening right now should be good. It should be revolutionary. It should increase productivity in ways that we haven't been able to in recent years. Dee, I could talk to you for hours, but we should probably wrap it up there. So hope to see you again in person, preferably next time soon, whether in New York or New Orleans or wherever else in the world. Thanks for making the time.
Look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Well, let's hope that Jacob's optimism for technological change and the portfolio opportunities it provides prevails over some of the darker possibilities laid out in that interview. I want to get straight to the key takeaways I have from Dee's discussion. First, expect more intense expressions of strange weather and climate problems. Dee thinks that summer 2023 will be a heck of a lot worse than summer 2022, and that we should expect more displaced people. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, he believes that it will grind down to a stalemate or possibly even a victory for Ukraine, but Dee strongly believes the world must provide Putin an off-ramp. But relative peace there is unlikely to bring major fixes to supply chains, which Dee believes are not going back to the way they were, simply put. And to that end, Dee says investors need to be better informed or seriously consider taking a more passive role in their investment. Now, when it comes to China, Dee believes relations could thaw with the United States. He doesn't expect a rapprochement, but he does believe that there may be some type of accommodation, as he calls it. Even so, Dee says he would not invest in China now and would be very alert if he did have investments there, because he sees many issues working against Xi Jinping. Social, food, and environmental problems, all working against China's leader. And the regime of low inflation, he says, is over. In Dee's view, inflation may now be structural, with the world moving to resilience and robustness, because just-in-time inventory just doesn't work in his view, and that means that everything will remain more expensive. Food shortages will only increase, whether it's baby food, cranberries and turkeys, it's going to be much harder to enjoy that Thanksgiving meal and many meals beyond. A rather stark view for 2023.
We hope you enjoyed the video. At Real Vision, we help you understand the complex world of finance, business, and the global economy with in-depth analysis from real experts. Join the revolution at realvision.com.